There's a moment in every empire's history where the thing that built it becomes the thing that breaks it. And right now, in real time, we are watching that exact moment unfold inside one of the most powerful technology companies the world has ever seen. I'm not talking about a headline. I'm not talking about an analyst's prediction. I'm talking about something far more uncomfortable than that. A slow, accelerating, mathematically documented erosion that no press release, no earnings call spin, and no marketing campaign can paper over anymore. The man who once stood in front of a room full of executives and called Linux a cancer is now watching that cancer. His word, not mine, systematically replaced the very operating system that made him a billionaire. And the truly remarkable part, it's not happening because of some brilliant competitor with better funding or a slicker product. It's happening because of something Microsoft fundamentally cannot fight. It's happening because of millions of ordinary people who quietly decided they were done. Let me take you through exactly how this unfolded, why it matters more than most people realize, and why the numbers tell a story that the corporate narrative desperately wants you to ignore. To understand where we are, you need to go back to where it all started. Bill Gates didn't build Microsoft by being the best programmer in the room. He built it by understanding something that almost nobody else in the early personal computing era grasped clearly. The value wasn't in the hardware. The value was in the software layer that sat between the user and the machine, specifically the operating system. When IBM came to Microsoft looking for an operating system for their new personal computer, Gates didn't just see a contract. He saw a lever. He understood that if Windows became the default environment, the thing every computer shipped with, the thing every developer built for, the thing every office worker learned first, then you didn't just own a product. You owned the foundation that everything else was built on. And once you owned the foundation, the entire structure above it became dependent on your decisions. That insight was genuinely brilliant, and for decades it worked exactly as designed. Windows became the default. Developers built for Windows because that's where the users were. Users stayed on Windows because that's where the software was. Companies deployed Windows because their employees already knew it. The cycle reinforced itself with every passing year, and the moat grew deeper and wider, until most of the industry stopped questioning whether there was an alternative at all. The alternative, Linux, existed. It was free, it was powerful, but it always seemed perpetually almost ready. Promising in theory, frustrating in practice, beloved by developers, but inaccessible to everyone else. That story, the story of Linux as the eternal underdog, the almost but not quite operating system, is the story Microsoft spent decades successfully promoting. And for most of that time, it was even true. Here's the thing about moats, though. They don't disappear overnight. They erode, quietly, incrementally, grain by grain, until one day you look down and realize the water is gone. Let's talk about the number Microsoft does not want you to read in the same sentence as their monthly active Windows users figure. That figure, which the company proudly references in investor presentations and keynote addresses, sits at approximately 1 billion. 1 billion Windows users. An installed base so large it seems invincible, so broad it seems permanent. Now read this number alongside it, 240 million. That is the number of fully functional operational computers that Microsoft officially abandoned with a single policy decision. When the Windows 10 support deadline arrived, 240 million machines, computers that still worked perfectly, that could run applications, connect to the internet, do everything their owners needed them to do, were told they had reached the end of their useful life. Not because they had stopped working, not because they lacked processing power for everyday tasks, but because they didn't meet the hardware requirements for Windows 11. Think about what that decision actually communicated to those users. Microsoft looked at 240 million people and said, in effect, your computer is no longer our problem. You can buy new hardware. You can pay for extended security support. You can accept that your machine will eventually become a security liability. Or, and this is the option that Microsoft's planning apparently failed to adequately model, you can install an operating system that costs absolutely nothing, runs beautifully on older hardware, and is actively maintained by a global community that doesn't have an upgrade cycle to sell you. What Microsoft manufactured with that single policy decision was 240 million motivated Linux converts. Not curious observers, not people vaguely interested in alternatives, motivated. People who had a concrete, immediate, financially driven reason to look at Linux and ask the question they'd never seriously asked before, can this actually work for me? And here is what they found when they asked that question in 2023 and 2024 in numbers that the Linux distribution download statistics document with uncomfortable clarity. Yes, it actually can. The gaming community's relationship with Windows had always been the most powerful retention mechanism in the consumer market. If you wanted to game on a PC, you used Windows. That wasn't ideology. That wasn't brand loyalty. That was pragmatism. The gaming library was built on DirectX. Anti-cheat systems ran at the kernel level on Windows. The compatibility question wasn't even worth asking because the answer was obvious before you finished the sentence. Valve changed that. Not with a press release, not with a marketing campaign, with a product. When the Steam Deck launched, it shipped with a Linux operating system and a compatibility layer called Proton running underneath. And it ran Windows games. Not some games, not most games. Thousands upon thousands of titles from the existing Steam library, running on Linux hardware at frame rates and quality levels that made the experience genuinely comparable to native Windows gaming. The significance of this cannot be overstated. Every time someone had explained to a gamer why they couldn't switch to Linux, the gaming library was the argument. It was the wall, and Valve didn't tear the wall down with a manifesto. They handed millions of people a device that fit in their hands, and quietly demonstrated that the wall had already been dismantled without anyone noticing. The technologies that made this possible, the DXVK translation layer, the Proton compatibility framework, the systematic engineering investment that Valve had been making for years, didn't arrive suddenly. They had been building incrementally, game by game, compatibility fix by compatibility fix, in a process so unglamorous that the mainstream tech press largely ignored it, until the Steam Deck made it impossible to ignore. When a gamer who had been attached to Windows exclusively because of their game library discovers that the library runs on Linux, you have not just removed an obstacle, you have eliminated the primary reason they were staying, and all the other reasons to leave. The privacy concerns, the advertising, integration, the forced updates arriving at the worst possible moments, the telemetry running in the background. Those reasons had been accumulating for years. They just hadn't been enough to overcome the gaming dependency. The moment that dependency dissolved, every accumulated grievance became a departure motivation. The gaming community's migration to Linux represents something strategically significant that Microsoft's investment in gaming acquisitions implicitly acknowledges as a recognized vulnerability. You don't spend tens of billions acquiring gaming studios to build a defensive position if you believe your platform advantage is unassailable. You do it when you've recognized that the platform advantage is eroding, and you need a different kind of lock-in before the erosion reaches the foundation. And the erosion runs deeper than casual observation suggests. The anti-cheat software that historically made competitive online gaming on Linux practically impossible, the kernel-level systems that verified Windows environment integrity and refused to run on anything else, is being addressed game by game, developer by developer, as the commercial reality of a growing Linux player base changes the economic calculation for studios who want access to that audience. The number of Steam games verified or playable on the Steam Deck's Linux operating system grows with every passing month. Not because Valve mandated it, because developers went where their players went. When a platform's lock-in mechanism starts dissolving at the engineering level, you don't recover that ground through marketing. You recover it by solving the underlying problem, which means either building a genuinely better product or accepting the migration as a permanent shift in the landscape. Microsoft's response to the gaming community's Linux migration has consisted primarily of the former, investing in Game Pass, acquiring studios, building cloud gaming infrastructure, while the latter quietly continues regardless. The consumer story is dramatic. The enterprise story is arguably more important. When a frustrated individual leaves Windows for Linux, that represents one lost license, one lost upsell opportunity, one data point in a trend. When a government ministry or a major financial institution makes the same decision, that represents something structurally different. It represents the conclusion of a deliberate, multi-year, analytically rigorous evaluation process conducted by professionals whose job is to assess total cost of ownership, vendor dependency risk, and regulatory compliance exposure. The enterprise migration to Linux has been happening for years, but the pace has been accelerating for reasons that have nothing to do with idealism and everything to do with economics and law. Start with the financial picture. Every computer in a large organization running Windows represents a license fee. That fee recurs, it increases, and it comes with the expectation that when Microsoft decides the current version of Windows has reached end of life, the organization will upgrade, which frequently means new hardware, new deployment infrastructure, new training, cycles. The total cost of ownership calculation for Windows in an enterprise environment is not just the license price. It's the license price, plus the hardware refresh cycle that Windows version transitions impose, plus the IT labor required to manage updates and compatibility across a large fleet of machines. Linux's total cost of ownership calculation is structurally different. The license fee is zero. The upgrade cycle doesn't force hardware obsolescence on a Microsoft-determined schedule. Distributions offer long-term support horizons of 5 or 10 years, during which the software is actively maintained, without requiring newer hardware. The IT labor picture is more complex and migration costs are real, but the ongoing licensing economics eventually produce a return on investment that the Budget Committee's rational analysis cannot dismiss as impractical. And then there's the regulatory dimension, which has become increasingly significant as data protection law has matured globally. The European Union's General Data Protection Regulation created legal obligations around personal data that organizations take seriously because the penalties for non-compliance are substantial. When your operating system collects behavioral data as a designed architectural feature, not as an opt-in, but as a built-in telemetry system whose scope and configuration, a closed-source codebase, makes it impossible to independently verify, your data protection officer faces a problem. You can attempt to configure the telemetry settings. You can read Microsoft's documentation about what data is and isn't collected. But you cannot audit the underlying code. You cannot independently verify that your configuration is achieving what you believe it's achieving. You are trusting a vendor's documentation about their own product's behavior. Linux doesn't present this problem architecturally. The source code is available for inspection. The telemetry question has a different answer. There isn't a default telemetry system baked into the operating system whose scope is defined by the vendor's commercial interests. For a data protection officer trying to demonstrate GDPR compliance, that architectural difference isn't a minor preference. It's a legally meaningful distinction. Germany's government migration away from Microsoft products has received significant coverage over the years. But what's most notable about the current moment is the way that story has shifted from idealistic experiment to implemented reality. The municipality that completes its Linux migration doesn't just save the annual license fee, it eliminates the exposure to the next forced upgrade cycle, the next pricing, negotiation where the vendor holds structural leverage, and the next data privacy audit where the operating system's telemetry architecture is the question the auditor is asking. France, Spain, and several Nordic countries have public sector Linux deployments at various stages of maturity. The common thread running through all of them isn't anti-American sentiment or open source ideology. It's the straightforward recognition that dependency on a single foreign vendor for the operating system running critical government infrastructure represents a sovereignty risk that, given a technically viable alternative, rational policymaking cannot indefinitely justify maintaining. India's government technology programs have made significant investments in Linux-based infrastructure. Brazil's public sector has been deploying Linux for years in contexts ranging from municipal services to educational computing. The pattern across jurisdictions with different politics, different economies, and different relationships to the United States has the same underlying logic. When you can achieve the same functional outcomes with zero licensing cost, and without the vendor dependency that comes with a proprietary platform, the case for the proprietary alternative requires justification that we've always done it this way cannot provide as the long-term answer. There's a narrative that Microsoft's defenders return to when the Linux growth story comes up, and it's worth addressing directly because it contains a genuine truth that deserves acknowledgement before we explain why it doesn't change the fundamental analysis. The truth it contains. Microsoft's business is not collapsing. Azure is growing. The enterprise cloud business is thriving. Microsoft has diversified successfully enough that the Windows desktop's declining share doesn't threaten the company's overall financial health in the near term. Satya Nadella's strategic pivot toward cloud services and subscription software represents a genuine and largely successful adaptation to the changing computing landscape. All of that is accurate, and none of it addresses the specific shift that's happening, because the specific shift isn't primarily about Microsoft's revenue. It's about the relationship between the world's computer users and the operating system that has governed that relationship as the default assumption for more than 3 decades. The assumption that Windows was permanent, that the switching costs were prohibitively high, that the gaming dependency was an unbreakable lock-in, that the application ecosystem had no functional alternative, that Linux was perpetually almost ready but practically inadequate. Every single one of these assumptions is being invalidated simultaneously, not sequentially, where you might address one problem and stabilize the situation. Simultaneously, in a convergence where each resolved barrier removes weight from the switching cost calculation and makes the remaining barriers easier to overcome. The gaming dependency is dissolved by Proton. The application ecosystem gap is closed by the maturation of open source productivity software, browser-based applications, and compatibility layers. The hardware abandonment decision converts 240 million hesitant Windows users into actively motivated Linux evaluators. The privacy concern accumulates regulatory weight in jurisdictions, where legal exposure makes it a compliance priority rather than a personal preference. Each of these developments would be significant individually. Together, in the same compressed period, they represent the inflection point that the Windows monopoly's permanent assumption did not survive as a predictive framework. Here's what's happening right now, today, as you watch this. The Linux distribution download servers are running at volumes that reflect not the gradual year-over-year growth that characterized the previous decade of Linux adoption, but the accelerated intake of a community receiving an unusual influx of newcomers. Ubuntu, Linux Mint, Fedora, and Pop! OS, the distributions most commonly recommended to new users for their approachable interfaces and strong hardware compatibility, all reported significant spikes in download activity as the Windows 10 end of life deadline approached and landed. The Linux Mint team specifically called out the Windows refugee influx in their community communications. These are not theoretical future users. They are people who have already made the switch and are now asking the new user questions that all new users ask. The forums where experienced Linux users answer questions and help with migrations are populated with a specific kind of question that tells you everything about where these new arrivals are coming from. The question pattern looks like this. I've been on Windows for 20 years. My computer got left behind. I installed Ubuntu last week, and I can't figure out how to do this specific thing. How do I get started? That question, in that form, from that demographic of user, the long-term Windows user making a first migration driven by hardware abandonment rather than ideological conviction, is the signal that the aggregate download statistics confirm as the pattern. The person asking it is not a developer, is not a privacy activist, is not someone who had been planning the switch for years, is someone whose familiar tool was taken away by a corporate decision and who discovered, in the process of looking for alternatives, that the alternative they'd always been told wasn't ready actually is. What happens to those users matters not just as a data point, but as a compounding mechanism. The person who successfully migrates from Windows to Linux becomes, through their own experience, a counter-narrative to the Linux isn't ready for regular users story that has historically suppressed adoption. They tell their family members, they help their friends, they share the experience online where it reaches people facing the same decision. The community receiving the exodus grows in its capacity to support future arrivals. The virtuous cycle of growing community, improving software support, expanding hardware compatibility, and increasing developer investment rotates faster as the adoption base expands. Hardware manufacturers are noticing. Dell's XPS line, Lenovo's ThinkPad series, and System76's purpose-built Linux machines represent a commercial response to a market signal that the industry is now reading seriously. When major OEMs begin certifying hardware for Linux compatibility and offering Linux pre-installed as a purchase option at scale, the hardware support argument against Linux migration, another historically significant barrier, begins dissolving alongside the gaming and application ecosystem arguments. The developer community, which had long been Linux native for server work while maintaining Windows machines for desktop use, is completing the transition to Linux desktops at a rate that the annual developer surveys from Stack Overflow and JetBrains document as a steady, accelerating trend. The developer who does all their meaningful work in a Linux environment running inside WSL on Windows has already crossed most of the practical threshold towards switching to Linux natively. The remaining distance is less about capability than about the accumulated inertia of a setup that mostly works. Remove the inertia through a hardware abandonment event, and the remaining distance disappears. This is how platform transitions happen. Not in a single dramatic moment, not in the quarterly earnings report that announces the tipping point, in the accumulated weight of millions of individual decisions, each one rational on its own terms, whose aggregate the statistics eventually document as the movement that everyone can see in retrospect, even if it was invisible in the moment. It would be incomplete to discuss this transition without acknowledging what Bill Gates actually built and what it meant. The personal computing revolution that Microsoft enabled was a genuine historical achievement. The accessibility of computing technology to populations who had never interacted with a computer, enabled by affordable hardware and an operating system whose graphical interface made the technology approachable without technical expertise, represents a foundational contribution to how the modern world communicates, works, learns, and operates. The Windows platform's ubiquity created the conditions for the Internet's mass adoption. The developer ecosystem it enabled produced the software that made computers useful to ordinary people. None of that diminishes because the platform's competitive position is now under pressure. What Gates built was the right solution for the era whose requirements it addressed. Centralized development by a well-resourced corporate entity could deliver consistency, quality control, and commercial support structures that the distributed open source model was not yet capable of matching at equivalent scale. The proprietary platform's premium was justified by a genuine capability advantage. The moat was real. What has changed is not that Microsoft became incompetent. What has changed is that the era's requirements changed, and the capability gap that justified the proprietary platform's premium closed. The open source development model that produced Linux has matured to the point where the quality, consistency, and usability arguments for preferring the proprietary alternative no longer hold in the everyday computing contexts that represent most of the market. The moat's depth, which was once sufficient to retain users despite the accumulating grievances of advertising integration, privacy erosion, forced upgrade cycles, and hardware abandonment decisions, is no longer sufficient when the technical alternatives have reached functional parity for the tasks most users actually perform. That's not a condemnation of what Microsoft built. It's a description of how technology cycles work. The right solution for one era becomes the incumbent that the next era's right solution displaces. The displacement is uncomfortable for the incumbent and liberating for the users who find that the new solution serves them better. That's not tragedy. That's progress. The shock, when people describe the current moment as shocking, isn't the existence of Linux or the existence of migration. The shock is the specific convergence of conditions that made the permanent assumptions simultaneously false. Microsoft spent decades, successfully, mostly accurately, communicating a narrative in which the switching costs were too high, the application ecosystem was too important, the gaming library was too dependent, and the Linux alternative was too technically demanding for regular users to realistically consider. That narrative was accurate enough for long enough that it became an unexamined assumption rather than a claim requiring ongoing verification. The moat was so established that people stopped checking its depth. What the current moment reveals is that the depth was contingent rather than permanent. Contingent on the gaming library remaining incompatible with Linux. Contingent on productivity software having no viable open source alternative. Contingent on Microsoft not making a hardware policy decision that converted 250 million users from passive Windows customers into active Linux evaluators. Remove those contingencies, and the moat is revealed to be substantially shallower than the decades of narrative suggested. The users leaving Windows are not making an ideological choice. Most of them would happily have stayed. They are making a practical calculation. The cost of staying has increased, the cost of leaving has decreased, and the alternative has crossed the threshold of adequate for their actual use cases. That calculation, made by individuals independently across millions of contexts, is producing the aggregate result that the download statistics document as the exodus now in progress. The community that Microsoft cannot buy, cannot replicate, and cannot extinguish is receiving them. That phrase, the community Microsoft cannot buy, is worth dwelling on because it identifies the structural reason why the corporate response to Linux's growth cannot be what the corporate response to prior competitive threats has been. Microsoft has historically addressed competitive threats through acquisition, through bundling, through integration into the Windows ecosystem, or through the patient accumulation of resources sufficient to outcompete the challenger on their own terms. These strategies work against corporate competitors because corporate competitors have assets that can be purchased, incentives that can be matched, and organizational structures that can be disrupted. Linux is not a corporate competitor. It has no acquisition target. It has no CEO whose compensation package defines their retention price. It has no investor base that can be pressured. It exists as the accumulated contribution of thousands of developers across decades, governed by a community whose distributed ownership and open source license structure makes it structurally resistant to the corporate acquisition strategy that Microsoft has deployed effectively against commercial competitors throughout its history. You cannot buy Linux. You cannot acquire the community that maintains it. You can contribute to it. Microsoft does in specific areas where their own products depend on Linux infrastructure, but you cannot control it, cannot redirect it in ways the community doesn't endorse, and cannot remove it from the competitive landscape through the financial mechanisms that work against corporate targets. This is the structural asymmetry that makes the current situation different from every prior competitive threat Microsoft has navigated. The thing eating Windows is not something that can be purchased into alignment. It is something that was built by people who chose to build it, is maintained by people who choose to maintain it, and is growing because users are choosing to use it. None of those choices are for sale. Here is where we land. The question is not whether Linux is ready. The question is not whether the migration is happening. Both of those debates have been settled by the evidence of the last several years. The download numbers, the Steam Deck's mainstream success, the enterprise migration case studies from European governments and financial institutions, the flood of Windows 10 refugees filling Linux community forums. These are not projections. They are documented present tense realities. The question worth asking now is what the acceleration of this moment means for how people relate to the computers they use every day. For decades, that relationship was mediated by an operating system that billions of people didn't choose so much as inherit. That came pre-installed, that was the default, that was assumed rather than selected. The alternative existed, but the alternative required something most people weren't ready to invest. Deliberate choice. What Microsoft's hardware abandonment decision did, perhaps more consequentially than any other single factor in Linux's recent growth, is force the deliberate choice, removed the inertia, replaced the passive continuation of the default with an active decision point. And when millions of people stood at that decision point and asked what their actual options were, they found an alternative that their prior assumptions about Linux, assumptions that were often outdated, shaped by the experience of Linux a decade ago rather than Linux today, had led them to underestimate. What they found was an operating system that works, that runs on the hardware they already own, that costs nothing, that respects their privacy in ways the proprietary alternative no longer does, that plays the games they want to play, that runs the applications they need, that has a community of people willing to help them when they get stuck. The man who called Linux a cancer built an empire on the insight that controlling the software layer beneath the application was the lever that controlled the entire stack. What he couldn't fully anticipate was that the same logic would eventually vindicate the community that built the alternative. That the operating system beneath everything else, the layer that mediates between the user and the machine, would matter enough to people that when the incumbent gave them a sufficiently compelling reason to look elsewhere, they would look. And when they looked, they would find that the alternative had become, somewhere in the years of patient development and incremental improvement, ready. The abandonment is not coming. The departure is not predicted. It is here, it is measured, it is accelerating. And the only genuinely surprising thing about it is how long it took for everyone to notice that the moat had already drained.